Thank you guys for having me out here. I appreciate it. And much to Mike Stewart's credit, you're lucky to have him. Much to his credit, unlike some in his position, he's not scared to take on these issues because these are the kind of issues, and this one in particular matters an awful lot to public health and safety in your state. I came out here to report answers on 4 questions that we asked in Colorado about 6 years ago, really with medical starting way back in 2002. We said in Colorado, what if we put medicine on the market by popular vote instead of the stodgy old-fashioned way of research, study, scientific review, peer review, and regulation? What if we allowed people to make money selling something we put in our bodies that's physically addictive and financially incentivize those people to increase the addictive potency of that substance as energetically as possible and earn more and more money the more powerful they made that substance, especially for kids? What if we did this with a substance that's also federally illegal, so the FDA and other regulatory authorities at a federal level can't touch it, can't interfere with us or regulate it themselves? What if we then expanded this substance to commercial markets? We created a commercial addiction industry before studying it to figure out if and how we could minimize the harms. These are the questions Colorado set out to answer when it started with medical marijuana in 2002 and with full-scale commercialization in 2012. The governor in Colorado referred to the answer, those questions and are engaging in answering them as a grand experiment. The laboratory rats in this experiment were these things: our children, our environment, and our communities. These are the people and the places we unleashed this experiment on. We unleashed these forces on. And I looked for, because there's got to be, a great Will Ferrell movie quote about a setup like this where Will Ferrell says, "What could go wrong?" Couldn't find it. The internet failed me on that. But I want to report to you the results of this experiment. Particularly, there have been so many impacts, but particularly in these categories, these elements, the community, our adults, our children, and our environment, how they've been impacted by this experiment. I wanted to do this, willing to do it, happy to do it, because while Colorado has been, our governor said, a grand experiment in this area, others have called Colorado, who has more experience with than any state in the country on this, the sacrificial lamb on this topic. And it's important that states like West Virginia learn from our experiences. And I think that you may conclude, again, it's about facts and education, but you may conclude at the end of this, when you see what's happened to us, that tightly controlling what's already passed on the medical marijuana front here and beating back the industry and the lobby's attempt to expand to commercialization may be in your interest. First set of lab rats affected by our experiment are the youth of Colorado. Some basic learning some basic facts that have emerged over 6 years of commercialization. That our youth usage rate of marijuana is 85% higher than our national average. More than 1 in every 5 high school students in Colorado is a regular drug user. This third bullet is very dense. Let me touch on this in a little more detail. There is a lot of now emerging after commercialization, after we started the experiment, after we allowed popular vote to create a medicine. Science is starting to emerge that the industry doesn't want you to hear about, that indicates a decrease in IQ of 8 points permanently into adulthood among people who are regular adolescent marijuana users. This is about the same IQ decrease that scientists told us many, many years ago is associated with lead paint exposure that led to greater regulation and decrease in lead exposure in gasoline and in paint. Same thing with marijuana. We see among our adolescent users increased depression, decreased school performance, more suspensions, lower test scores, lower performance, more suspensions, etc. And there is a great study, a great longitudinal study that talks about the increased risk of psychosis among adolescent users. This is a very interesting topic. When people talk about marijuana generally, people think they're talking about stuff, the Woodstock marijuana. They think they're talking about marijuana that maybe, I'm 58 years old, that maybe got smoked back when I was in high school in the 70s, 2 to 5% THC. The average THC level in marijuana you buy in a store in Colorado is around 20% now. Okay? Keep that in mind. The only longitudinal study that looks at the impacts of high THC marijuana is this study, I think, Kevin, from Australia, New Zealand, similar. New Zealand study, 2 to 4% increase in psychosis among regular users of marijuana, adolescent users of marijuana. That test was done with 16% THC. That's 4% lower than Colorado's average now. England. Okay, it's this country that speaks English that did this study, somewhere on the planet. All right, and that increased risk of psychosis is seen to increase as the potency increases. And one of the things you'll learn today is the industry is incentivized to increase potency and has gotten very good at innovations that increase potency. So we've seen that impact on our youth, that increased potency, that increased risk of psychosis, 2 to 4-fold risk among adolescents, is also accompanied by an impairment in the function of the nerve fibers that are responsible for the two sides of your brain communicating with each other. Okay? That impairment, a destruction of that communication across the two sides of the brain, also increases as concentration of THC increases. Let's see. We also see other drug use, polydrug use, increasing as adolescents use marijuana. This is from Tom Gorman's Rocky Mountain Heights study, this next one, that caught my eye from their most recent report. 21% of youth suicides in Colorado now show marijuana in this system. I'm not saying the marijuana caused the suicide. I'm saying it's a noticeable fact, and it's an increasing number over the 6 years of our legalization. We see more and more of that. The other impact we see on our youth that's very disturbing is the industry's aggressive marketing of devices that allow youth to use our highest concentration THC without detection. Inhalers that can deliver 90% THC concentrate, as if you're just treating asthma or some respiratory issue around the school grounds. Eyeliner cases, portable eyeliner cases you might see in any woman's purse are actually vape pens. These are vape pens. People know what vaping is. It's a means of delivering high concentrate, especially THC, by vaporizing instead of combusting it, instead of burning it so it smells. Cartridge with high concentrate THC is put in a device like this with a heating element. It heats it up to the point the liquid becomes vapor and you inhale it. No one can smell it. It's much easier to avoid detection. This is my favorite. What possible use is there for a device like this that delivers 90+% THC straight to your system in a vapor form? What possible use for this is there other than to get kids doing this in a classroom, a school, a gym, at home, without an adult knowing they're using the product? So these things are on sale in Colorado, in head shops and in marijuana dispensaries. Highlighter vape pens. In Colorado, we have no potency limits. The industry has realized, as other addiction industries have learned, tobacco, alcohol, and opioids, if you create a young demand population, if you addict a young population, that's where 80% of your profit's going to come from. 80% of your profit, alcohol, tobacco, and in marijuana, comes from your heaviest users. When the brain is soft and developing, addiction occurs more easily, and your user has that whole lifespan to be tied to your product and need to buy it from you. So we see, not coincidentally, over the course of the last 6 years, the concentrate sales, the sales of these products that now average 70% THC, and some of them have concentrates in the mid-90s, okay, percentages of THC in the mid-90s. But every year, the percentage average of concentrates increases. This last year it hit 70%. And as I said, this is unstudied, all right? The only study from whatever English-speaking country is at 16%. And every year in Colorado, we see the percentage of these concentrates going up and up and up, and the sale percentage, the market percent, going up and up and up, and the industry crowing about that. Edible sales, these are all marijuana products, folks. Anything you put in your body, and that includes suppositories, you can buy in Colorado with high concentrate THC in it. Lollipops, candy, cotton candy, candy corn, gummy bears, cookies, brownies, mints, breath spray. That's a good one. 90% concentrate THC breath spray. The sales of this stuff increased 14% in Colorado last year. The sale of the pure concentrate, stuff they call butter, shatter, wax, 94% increase last year in Colorado. Again, not by accident. And the highest percentage of users in the market of concentrates, the highest percent, are kids under 22 years of age. So that's what we've seen in Colorado. And that's why we've seen it, because of the incentive in the industry to hook these kids with concentrates early, to give them devices that allow them to be hooked without any adult catching them. The environment, I am not going to get in the way of Dr. Murad Gabriel's presentation this afternoon. He really is a national expert, and you have many national experts here on sort of subsets of my overview this morning. And he, as his hour-and-a-half presentation touches on this first point, and listen carefully to him. We have seen, especially in Colorado, where 30+% of our land mass is public land. West of the Continental Divide, 66% of Colorado is BLM, Forest Service, or National Park land. So we've had massive public land grows. These are cartel members primarily, some smaller operators, but primarily Mexican cartels going into the forest and stealing water from creeks and stock ponds and tearing up the forest, leaving a mess behind, and producing marijuana using pesticides that are nerve agents. As you'll hear from Dr. Gabriel, pesticides, if you can call them that, like carbofuran, literally banned in the United States but used in third world countries to kill things like lions, right? These are nerve agents that kill very quickly, that get into the food supply, get into the mammal food supply, the water and the soil. We've seen that throughout our beautiful public lands in Colorado. Water diversion, I touched on. Water is precious in Colorado. It's scarce. We send much of our water to the desert states to our west. So we don't need to be, and we lose a lot of it now through diversion illegally, especially in the western part of the state. There's 2.7 liters of water per day per adult plant. So not only does water get diverted, but even in legal, when I say legal today, I mean state law legal. None of this is legal under federal law, but even in legal state operations, an adult marijuana plant consumes every day the same amount of water that my doctor tells me I need to drink every day. When you have millions of marijuana plants in Colorado, whether grown in a sophisticated greenhouse or grown by a Mexican cartel on public lands, that's like adding 1 million adult human beings to the strain of your water supply. In Colorado, many of the same people who support the industry claim they support conservation and the environment. And frankly, I think a lot of them are unaware of these basic facts. What a stress on water resources and electricity resources marijuana production is. 17 times more electricity per square foot is used to cultivate marijuana than it takes per square foot to light and heat a residence. 17 times more electricity. When I mentioned this fact in an op-ed, I had an angry pro-marijuana guy go on his little talk radio show and say he thought this was an absurd point because they're using electricity, they're not using coal or oil or gas. So maybe I'm confused about where electricity comes from. Public health and safety, the great Tom Gorman, and I think maybe it's Dale or Ed One of those three HIDA folks is going to talk about traffic fatalities. This is an interesting topic, and you can get into the minutia of metabolites and blood testing and the difference between residual metabolite and actually the psychoactive THC at an impairment level in your system. I'm not going to get into all that. All I'm going to tell you is what matters a lot to public safety officials and responsible adults in Colorado. And that is, since we legalized marijuana, traffic fatalities on our roads are up 151%. ER visits for marijuana issues up 52%. Youth poison control admission for marijuana poisoning up 500%. That's intentional or accidental exposure. You saw the candy display in my earlier slide of all of these things, especially gummy bears. Tend to be a favorite. There is no regulation. Again, the FDA can't touch this stuff. There's no regulation on child-proof packaging. There's no regulation on label warnings. There's been some very, very minor voluntary things done by the industry in that regard. But that candy and all that edible stuff is very tough and impossible for a child to distinguish from regular snacks and candy. Hospitalizations in general for marijuana-related issues up 148%. Study was recently done by our biggest public research hospital and health center in Colorado. The University of Colorado did a study where they had a woman calling over 400 of our dispensaries and posing as someone who's in her first trimester of pregnancy and asking the person who answered the phone at the dispensary, look, I'm experiencing these morning sickness symptoms. Could marijuana help me? 70% of those dispensaries said absolutely. You should be using marijuana if you're experiencing morning sickness during your pregnancy. This is a rough, I'm not a doctor. You're going to hear from a doctor later. I had a chance to talk to him last night. He's got the real medical evidence on this. I happen to be friends with a woman who's the head of, who delivers basically all the babies and supervises the delivery of all the babies at our biggest public, lower income public health hospital in the Denver metro area, who confirmed some of the stuff you may hear this afternoon. The science so far, at least, links prenatal marijuana use, right? What 70% of the dispensaries told this woman she should be using, with at least links it to the following things for babies in utero: impaired fetal growth and neurodevelopment, risk of miscarriage, developmental and hyperactivity disorders, low birth rate, premature birth, risk of stillbirth, learning defects, altered responses to visual stimuli, gaps in problem solving, memory, ability to remain attentive, increased likelihood of marijuana use as a young adult, decreased motor development, birth defects. That's part of the list. No FDA regulation, none of the usual stuff the public expects its government will have done for it before allowing it to consume something. Lack of funds, which I'll get to in a minute, lead to things like we have in Colorado, where the industry runs the laboratory that tests for mold and pesticides in the product that we're telling people it's okay to put in their body, even calling medicine. That's led to over 40, at last count, over 40 recalls of these retail products, mostly edible products, sometimes concentrate products, for high levels of pesticides and molds, including pesticides that are I mean, I'm talking about in terms of individual things that have been recalled, hundreds of thousands of brownies, pieces of candy, etc. With pesticide levels that are banned beyond ban levels in any state, and certainly in Colorado. When you're combusting marijuana, like tobacco, it's carrying carcinogens just like tobacco is. Increased addiction rates across polydrug groups have resulted, and we've seen an increase in addiction rates in Colorado that has corresponded to the period of marijuana legalization. No reduction in, I'll mention this again later, this is another favorite argument that we heard in Colorado, and there have been billboards in other states and around the country that are simply false based on the Colorado experience, that somehow smoking weed is going to cure your opioid crisis. Every year since commercialized marijuana went live in Colorado, our opioid deaths have increased every year, despite, as I'm sure you've seen in Virginia, much more aggressive response to fix the opioid crisis from enforcement, public health, every stakeholder coming together in our state to try to reduce our opioid death rate. It goes up every year. We've had marijuana. Catch up here. We've also, on the public health side, a couple things I didn't mention. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration just released data from 16 and 17. Colorado is in the top 3 or 4 states in the country in every age group category of marijuana use. So since we've had legalization, and that was confirmed in that recent study. Another promise the industry made is if we introduce commercialized marijuana or medical marijuana, we're going to reduce our alcohol consumption. Also false. Every year since we've had legalization, our alcohol use rate in Colorado has gone up. Opioid deaths, as I said, have gone up every year, and no one has provided any evidence that marijuana cures opioid addiction. The industry in Colorado promotes one story I've heard again and again and again about a poor man who is a veteran with PTSD, got hooked on opioids. You may have heard other stories like this, and with great respect for his suffering and his courage in eventually beating his addiction. He got addicted to opioids. He came to Colorado. He says, and the industry says, marijuana cured my opioid addiction. If you listen to his story, what he's saying is he stopped using opioids and started using high concentrate marijuana. And then through the course of a year in a 12-step program with a lot of work and a lot of counseling and a lot of old-fashioned 12-step recovery, he beat his new addiction to marijuana. Is really how that story went. I don't know, do pets matter to people in West Virginia? Man, do they matter to people in Colorado. We had a lot of dogs in Colorado. I have 3 of them. The poisoning of household pets from marijuana is so common now. You go into any veterinarian in Colorado and they have a fact sheet on the counter. They have a stack of fact sheets on the counter about how to recognize the symptoms and how to treat marijuana pet poisoning. All right. Whether it's legal, let's talk about impacts on the community. I want to leave a little time for questions. So we have the kids, we have the environment, we have adult, generally public health and public safety. Let's talk about our communities. Whether it's the legal sales or black market, we have seen in Colorado destruction to physical houses themselves and the neighborhoods that they're in, a reduction in property value in those neighborhoods, a reduction in the quality of life, I call it the livability in communities and in particular subdivisions and neighborhoods. Pueblo, Colorado is an interesting example. Pueblo, Colorado might not be that different from Charleston, West Virginia. It's about 100,000 people total. The county's about 150,000 people. It's an area historically that has had periods of great economic success, mostly driven by a steel mill. When that steel mill closed down, Pueblo became, for decades and still is, a depressed town with about 50% of the able-bodied adults out of work, a lot of public assistance, a lot of stress on the health services and the public services associated with homelessness and mental health, and the exact kind of community that's desperately looking for some economic benefit, some industry to help them, some employment, some tax revenue. It's the low-hanging fruit type of community for this industry and for this lobby. Pueblo went all in on medical and then commercialized marijuana as a result of that dynamic. Please, put something in these storefronts, give somebody jobs, give us some sales tax revenue so we can rebuild our roads. They went all in and they have regretted it ever since. Every gas station you go to in Pueblo has got multiple people living out of their cars holding cardboard signs begging for money. The public health officials, the various people in state, local government who provide services at shelters, food banks, mental health, and public health places, clinics, etc., have told me that this, what used to be called marijuana travelers or trimmigrants, for trimming the marijuana plants, are a different kind of population to treat and deal with because they don't seem to want to get out of their circumstance. They have a great sense of entitlement and no desire to progress beyond that station in life. And they create an extraordinary burden on law enforcement and all those service providers. And that has become the character of Pueblo. The hardest hit, as you can tell from that, the hardest hit neighborhoods, communities throughout Colorado by commercialized marijuana are the most disadvantaged. The marijuana school suspension rate is almost 100% higher in Colorado schools that have the highest minority populations. Violent crime, a lot of mythology around violent crime with marijuana. There are two basic kinds of violent crime that we have seen that have emerged over 6 years that follow this substance and its legalization. One is the marijuana rip. Okay, that's somebody often from a different state setting up a buy on social media. Some, it'd be Craigslist, WhatsApp, whatever. We have seen these cases again and again and again with gangsters from as far away, urban gangsters from as far away as Miami, setting up deals to buy several pounds of black market marijuana in Colorado from folks they assume are hippies and pushovers and easy marks. Rent a car, steal a car, drive out to Colorado, shoot the seller, and take the dope. This is dope that in Miami is worth between, depending on the season, $5,000 to $7,000 a pound. Set up a deal, drive out, nice vacation, see some mountains, make tens of thousands of dollars. Arapahoe County, one of our sort of our most populous metro county around Denver, suburban county around Denver, had 11 of the 11 homicides that were marijuana rips in 2017. There are the aggravated assaults, the gun crime, even if it doesn't result in a homicide associated with these rips, have become very common throughout Colorado, including a triple homicide in Boulder last year, a homicide way out in a very rural blue-collar town of Grand Junction on the western slope. Mail theft is another exposure and danger and violence to mail. Postal Service employees delivering mail is something I wouldn't have expected, and I didn't hear anybody expect when we were talking about introducing this. The mail carriers, it's known in the criminal community that mail carriers now delivering in certain neighborhoods and to addresses that appear to be associated with grows may have large amounts of cash that are being mailed back to Colorado for marijuana that was sent out, primarily to the East Coast. And we've seen more and more violent crime associated with that. Not only do the advocates and the industry who wants to make money on this stuff have enough power and influence to make sure these dispensaries are not in their neighborhoods, that pushes these dispensaries into the most disadvantaged neighborhoods, and that has resulted in a reduction in arrests for white people for marijuana-related crimes by 8%, but an increase in the reduction of African Americans arrested for marijuana-related crimes, an increase of 58%. Increase among Hispanics in the Hispanic community of 29%. Talked a little bit about livability. A community that embraces marijuana, whether it's rural or urban, in the areas where they have grows, whether they're legal or whether they're black market, suddenly that neighborhood experiences high fencing, sometimes razor wire, aggressive looking dogs, people with guns, people with SUVs with tinted windows, generally hostile, menacing behavior to protect the grow area and the highly lucrative market that these folks are in. Now, the great Wendy Rohr from DEA, who's sitting in the back, is going to do a presentation that's riveting, and I'm going to skip through some of this. But what happens if you have a loose medical system or a full retail legalization system in your state? Is your state transforms from one that has drugs shipped to it, whether it's heroin, cocaine, whatever, to a state like Sinaloa, where that addictive substance is produced and sent out. You literally become a theater of operation for production cartels. That's what we've seen in Colorado on the most disturbing violent crime or crime side of this equation. That's our biggest lesson learned. Listen carefully to Wendy's presentation. The basic model, so without stealing her thunder, let me just tell you what the basic model is for these folks. Started with public land grows. When we put law enforcement pressure on the public land grows, the cartels, and I'm talking about Chinese, Cuban, and Mexican primarily, it's what we've seen in Colorado, have gone into neighborhoods, particularly subdivisions. So bedroom communities, homes from $300,000 to $600,000. Bought many, many, many homes very strategically. Don't buy more than 2 in one cul-de-sac. Don't buy more than 2 on any one block in the subdivision. Spread it out. Buy them in cash or through a straw for those high prices. Gut the house, turn it into a greenhouse. Turn a residential house into a greenhouse. Change the HVAC system. Redo the plumbing. Steal the water by digging in and tapping into it before the meter. Do the same thing with the electricity. Hot tap the electricity so you're overloading it so you can deal with the HVAC and the lighting demands that are required to have a sophisticated grow that can produce 60 to 90 day grow cycle plants that are so big, they're like Christmas trees. Some of these plants are 6 feet tall and they produce 3 pounds per plant every 60 to 90 days. Do that to the house. Structural damage, mold damage, holes in the house for ventilation, digging to tap into the water and the electrical line before it hits the meter, and create all these hazards that have led to explosion and destruction of that house. Basically, the house has to be rebuilt. It's worthless when they're done. When I say a lot of houses, okay, Wendy will give you these stats, but just to give you a teaser. So it's 3 pounds every 60 to 90 days per plant. Even if you can put 150 plants in a house, which you can easily do if you do what they do, gut it and turn it into a greenhouse. 150 plants in a year, that's $8 million in the Florida market at about $5,000 a pound. That's $8 million right there. So you can see why they were happy to take us up on our invitation. Why cross the border? Why grow in Mexico? That's not a circuit board. This is an Asian organization that my old office is prosecuting. 850 homes. So when I say a few homes in a cul-de-sac, carefully, strategically chosen, we have seen cases with these cartels from all 3 of those countries. They don't just have 100 homes. We had a case with 650 in El Paso County, over 850 now. There's Wendy's math. That was for only 100 plants. I added 50, so I could come up to 8 million. We had a case on one of these cartels and talked to, as a cooperator, one of the defendants, who explained it like this to our assistant U.S. attorney when he proffered, when this defendant proffered. Laughing. What do you mean, why are we doing this? We're in business. Minimize the risk, maximize the profit. There are 5 links in the chain of this business. When you're in a state where everyone thinks marijuana is legal, people aren't paying attention to it, the public figures It's regulated somehow. The government's taking care of this. What my neighbor is doing or what that guy is doing across the valley on his rural property, he must have a license for that. That guy with the pickup truck that's full of grow lights and bags of marijuana must be a licensed industry member. The first 4 links in this chain have almost no risk anymore. That's why the cartels are in Colorado. You can get a site, you can plant the crop, you can cultivate that crop, and you can harvest that crop without drawing any extraordinary attention, without drawing law enforcement or community attention. The only thing you have to worry about is transporting that dope back to a state where it's not legal, where you can sell it for $5,000 to $7,000 a pound. So that's why we have had in Colorado a complete sea change in this criminal drug problem, from receiving dope that comes up from Mexico or comes from California to a theater of operation production state. All right. Not really a grand experiment. In hindsight, the phrase grand experiment can only be seen as cruel and laughable. The laboratory was blown up with the lighting of the first Bunsen burner. The cart was put before the horse. Importantly, you'll be told you're going to get something out of it. Troyer's reporting on all this bad stuff that happened to kids and communities, stressed law enforcement, allowed criminal organizations to thrive, and thank you for inviting them to your state. You must have gotten something out of it. Well, much like buying Clark Stanley snake oil liniment, we were promised that marijuana could cure just about everything. It was going to fill our state coffers. As Mike mentioned, less than 1% of our state budget comes from marijuana taxation. It has not helped the budget in Colorado at all. In fact, because dealing with marijuana is such a strain on government resources, the state of Colorado has not even been able to put the resources into studying how much more it spends to deal with marijuana than it earns from its taxes. But anecdotally, the governor's office, every sheriff I've talked to, every police chief, everyone who actually manages a budget of a public organization in Colorado that's impacted by marijuana will tell you that they spend more than they get. So the tax revenue is low, and the cost of setting up, imagine if you had to set up basically your own FDA in West Virginia. Do you have an FDA equivalent? Does the state have that equivalent regulatory organization already set up? No. Does the state have a separate budget office already set up to track this stuff? How much are we earning and what's it costing us? No, you're going to have to set that up. This is big government that has to be built after the fact to try to contain and assess the risks and the harms. None of the tax revenue has gone to schools. That's what was promised. Schools haven't gotten any money out of this deal, but they've suffered the greatest impact. Like I said, all of those costs have exceeded the taxes collected. Now, more ancillary economic boost, but it's brought many jobs to Colorado. 16,000 total jobs. in 2018. 16,000 total jobs added to the state by this industry that's had all this impact. The average earning is under 15 bucks an hour. So those 16,000 people are making 12 to 15 bucks an hour, almost all of them. Other employees, other employers in Colorado have seen the drug test results for their employees triple now that marijuana is legal. They've seen their losses increase due to injury, absenteeism, and insurance rate increases because marijuana use by their employees is illegal. And the people who are making money on this in Colorado really are a handful. There are literally a handful of people who are making over $10 million, and there's another handful of people making between $1 million and $10 million. The woman who owns the operation that sells gummy bears, where her store buys gummy bears in bulk, huge bulk, unpackages them, lays them out, and sprays 70 to 90% THC on them, and then repackages and sells them. They made $18 million last year, Colorado. What we've also seen in the last couple of years is this, and you guys would experience this if you don't really tightly control the medical system, and certainly if you allowed open, full commercialization. There's a life cycle to this stuff. There's a desperation that's entered the industry in Colorado at year number 6. The folks who got in early, who took the biggest risks, like the gummy bear lady, are now desperate to get out. The Colorado industry sales, gross sales numbers in the industry, the first couple of years were going up 35%, then 31%, and then in the third year down to 19%. Last year the increase in the market was only 2.6%. Okay? What does that cause? That causes incredible pressure on the legislature to make it even easier to sell, to allow foreign investment, foreign national investment in Colorado license holders, to allow public trading in the stocks of those license holders. So those folks, those already wealthy few, can cash out now. And that desperate, frenzied marketing of high concentrates to those youngest users so they can lock them in as permanent profit centers. People ask me all the time around Colorado, what was it like to be the U.S. attorney during this 6-year period? And thought about that a lot. It was interesting. It's not the sort of priority and project I would have picked. But our battles often pick us, right? As first responders like to say. But both as U.S. attorney and as a citizen, I just want to end with this. My experience in Colorado, and I think a lot of Colorado experiences with this over the last 6 years, is pretty simple. This is what it feels like. To live in Colorado now feels like a bunch of outsiders, a bunch of carpetbaggers, a bunch of snake oil salesmen came in to take the gold out of our streams, or in West Virginia, the coal out of your hills. They came in, sold us a bill of goods, rushed around to get as much gold out of the streams as they possibly could, as fast as they could, to take the money and run and leave this behind. This is just one very common sight in our national forests now. This is a Mexican cartel encampment in a big public land grow in Colorado. That's what this industry feels like when you've lived for 6 years in a place where not only in the public lands, but in the neighborhoods and in the schools and in the urban environment, you have these incentives, this capitalism married up with an addiction industry, and Wall Street wealthy opportunists come in and leave this behind for you. Okay, questions? I'm going to be here all day, so we can talk on breaks as well.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for inviting me. You're right, I did not expect to be invited, and I thank you for your presentation. I guess since we have 5 minutes and I'll allow other people to ask questions, I'll narrow it down to one question, and that's if this is a failed experiment, then why have no policymakers in Colorado sought to repeal the legalization of cannabis? And in fact, Governor Hickenlooper, who used to be an opponent of legalization, has now changed his mind and now supports it. So, and not just in Colorado, in any of the states that have gone that way, how come nobody has turned back?
Yeah, it is a good question. I think you have that backward with Governor Hickenlooper.
I was in his office and met with him, and I don't think I do. I mean, he said he was against it, now he's for it.
When did he tell you he was for it?
Well, it was last year.
Yeah. So this year he's been telling, as he's on his way out, he's telling everybody who wants to listen that it's a bad idea and it was a mistake. Governor Hickenlooper, to his credit, had an extraordinary amount of pressure on him to sign into law the bill I was talking about that the industry has run every year that would allow foreign investment and public trading of marijuana stocks, and he vetoed it. And he got an awful lot of heat for that, but he vetoed that. And he's actually, in the last legislative session, he beat back a bill that would have allowed Domino's Pizza type delivery of marijuana, and it would have allowed drive-through marijuana stores, right? So, and the foreign investment bill, which was most dangerous. Right, and consumption clubs, which are marijuana bars. You go to a bar and buy marijuana instead of beer. But Hickenlooper aside, the basic answer to your question is it takes a lot of courage to do what he's done very recently, and he hadn't always had that courage, frankly. But he has recently, and he's been very strong on changing his position because he's seen these impacts. But here's what happens. It happens in a lot of circumstances. I'm sure I just happen to only have experience with marijuana. That lobby pays the politicians. The lobby has a lot of money and a lot of financial power and an extraordinary sophistication to their political influence because of that money. And now you're shaking your head. I know
we have not seen evidence of that here. We don't even. When we passed the bill here, there were no paid lobbyists pushing for it. And I can speak for most elected officials in this room. Nobody paid us to vote one way or the other on that bill or on any bill.
I'm not accusing you of, or anyone in this room of that. I'm telling you what's happening in Colorado.
Lobby here. It was passed because people of West Virginia ran our funds off the hook and supported it. That's why it passed, sir.
Yeah. No, and I didn't mean to offend you.
I said it. I'm just saying there wasn't a paid lobby here. I don't offend you.
I'll tell you a brief story. I wrote an op-ed stating some of these facts in 700 words recently in the Denver Post. They put me through a ringer on actually providing them all of the underlying studies that supported these numbers before they would publish it. Within days, a counter op-ed was published by a state representative in Longmont that had completely unsupported facts about how wonderful marijuana was. All right? Facts that had no sourcing whatsoever. They weren't facts at all. I quickly, through Kevin Sabet, dug into that particular legislator. Within 5 minutes, I figured out that this year he took $14,000 from the marijuana industry. That's a fact.
You talked about underage use. That same problem would appear to be the same as drinking or any other substance. What's the situation with enforcement? What is it, 21 in Colorado?
Yes.
So what's the situation with enforcement for people under 21, for high school students, et cetera? Can you not put a dent in that? The law enforcement not?
Yeah.
Here with drinking.
Sure. If you did nothing but that, if you turn law enforcement's attention entirely to enforcing nothing but the straw purchase of marijuana, to use an ATF term for guns, right? I mean, my kids are now 29 and 27, but they came of age when medical really took off. They were in high school, and they said it's easier to get marijuana than beer by far, okay? Because the very little of the adolescent use, the high school use, comes from those kids walking in with fake IDs or walking into a store that's not checking ID. Those stores are actually compliant, and the state regulatory division does a good job making sure they check IDs. But anybody 21 or older can buy it and turn a little profit reselling it. So it's very hard to enforce at that level.
I'm Eric Tarr. Thank you for doing this, first of all. What's happened to Colorado's workforce in the other industries outside of marijuana that that you've either drawn or lost in the state? For instance, maybe your CDL drivers, for instance, or any of the other sectors. Have you looked at that?
Yeah, I don't have. I'm not aware of any study, and I don't, as the U.S. attorney, you're seeing less the impact. I'm seeing less day-to-day the impact on the business community. But what you hear from the business community, obviously Denver took a hard run at Amazon, for example. I have no idea whether marijuana legalization played into their choice not to put one of their fulfillment centers there. But what you do hear from the business community, especially delivery services, manual labor related services, and the oil and gas industry, is that it's a nightmare. The drug testing, the headaches, the legality of fighting with employees, having employees who are impaired, but they have a card telling them the state has authorized them to smoke this stuff because it's medicine, because they have back pain. It's probably not very helpful because I don't have statistics on that, but it's become part of the business culture to adapt and figure out how to enforce against those employees, communicate them that they're still not allowed to use on the job to a level of impairment, and incur the additional insurance costs that come from having that employee base.
All right, I want to thank Bob Troyer. Let's give him a round of applause. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.